If you like a bit of history, then, you know, Madame Curie, I think she's going to come into Diane's talk. Franz Curie in 1934, similar spelling. Carbon-14's existence was suggested by him in 1934. It was discovered by the blokes there at the University of California, but the dating method was devised by Willard Libby. Now, basically, he was inventing a clock, and you may want to think about it. If you invent a new clock, the first thing you need to know is what time is it, because your clock is supposed to go backwards. Now, one of the most interesting things I found was a comment by Walter Libby, who says that he struck some problems because he couldn't find any literature that was older than 4,000 or so years, you know, back to the biblical flood. It's even written in his notes. That's the oldest he could find to compare it against. And then he found a problem with the measurements. And here's what he said about the problem he found with the measurements. If one were to imagine the cosmic radiation, why that? Because that's how it's produced. Cosmic radiation hits nitrogen that converts it into radioactive carbon. If one were to imagine that the cosmic radiation had been turned off, in other words, it hasn't always been the same. A short while ago, the enormous amount of radiocarbon necessary to the equilibrium state, you see carbon-14, like many things where you use equations, 3x has to equal 9. If you don't know what x is, and you don't know what 9 is, and you don't know what 3 is, then you don't have an equation. You can't solve anything. The enormous amount of radiocarbon necessary to the equilibrium state would not have been manufactured. And the specific radioactivity of living matter, that's carbon-14 in you, would be much less than the rate of production calculated from neutron intensity. Now, I guarantee your teacher in year 10 or year 11 or Woman's Weekly, who told you how carbon-14 proves things old, never ever mentioned this. Okay, it's important. Libby said he couldn't find any documents to match his carbon-14 against. Secondly, there was a problem. If you try to prove it's always been, you can't. It looks like it started fairly recently. Even in 2012, 60 years later almost, various geological, atmospheric and solar processes can influence atmospheric carbon-14 levels. This means the formation of carbon-14 is not constant. Since the formation of carbon-14, says Science Daily in October 2012, it's affected by Earth's magnetic field and solar activity and is therefore not constant. This relative timescale has no absolute timestamp in calendar years. So when you see statements, Aborigines have been in Australia for 70,000 years, that's a non-factual statement. You see, when I was a student, they hadn't been in Australia for 4,000 years. They got off Noah's Ark and walked like everybody else. Well, like many people, because they didn't have ocean-going boats. Even when you try to date Neanderthals, look at the statement from the University of Leeds. The radiocarbon chronometer is like a clock, sometimes running faster, but sometimes it stops. Now we're in 2000s. We're not in the 1800s. We're not in the 1700s. We're not in the 1900s. We're a long time after we've had opportunity to test and test and test. And of course, you get some funny ones. Radiocarbon Journal. If you have access to it, can I encourage you? When they first started doing radiocarbon, they invented this journal and they would file every result they got. It's a valuable resource because they weren't sophisticated enough to realize they were shooting themselves in the foot so often. The hair on the Shakubova mammoth was found to have a carbon-14 age of 26,000 years, but the peaty soil in which it was preserved was found to have a date of only 5,600 years. Now, I guess you can reach two conclusions. One is it took an awful long time to be buried and still have its hair intact. 5,000 from 26,000 is about 19,000 years to bury the thing. Alternatively, it died really slowly from inside out. So you get some funny results, some silly results. The same as you get with the seals. When the blood of a seal, and I first used this many, many years ago when I edited the Creation Journal. When the blood of a seal freshly killed at McMurdo Sound in the Antarctic was tested by carbon-14, it showed the seal had died 1,300 years ago. And we didn't invent it to put it in the Creation magazine. We borrowed it from others who'd used it before us, 1971. And of course, since then, they've discovered that they have to get rid of all the C values because the water itself affects the rate at which the carbon-14 will be absorbed. And of course, here's the conflict. Remember how our friend had Charles Lyell said Miami is to get rid of Moses? There's a literal reading of Genesis through to Matthew. Jesus is roughly 2,000 years ago. Moses, roughly 3,500. Babel, roughly 4,300. If you say the Aborigines have been here for 70,000 years, what are you doing to people's confidence in this record? Okay, by the time you get back to the first Adam, he's only 6,000 years ago, roughly. Now, the reality is they've achieved exactly what Lyell wanted. You want to get rid of Moses? Then change the dates. And it doesn't matter how many times you change the radiocarbon dates, you actually have never proved it, and yet you destroyed the opposition very subtly. When people say, oh, what about carbon-14? It's because they have no idea how the others work. I've got a few here that I'm going to check as we go through the program on coal and diamonds. And I'm going to finish with a look at working the thing backwards from a doctor who actually was my consultant at the Los Alamos Radioactive Project. But notice the last point. Are you one of those who will put faith in the biblical record, or will you put faith in Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin? Because that's your only choices. I wasn't there when the world was made. Joseph is even younger than I am. And Diane, she's somewhere in between. And we do not know from observation. But we either trust God who was there, who never lies, or we trust the scientists who've changed the values over and over again.